Now the difficulty with this passage is figuring out exactly who Jesus is talking about. Who gets judged in this passage? Now our reading says all the nations, and so that might seem to be just talking about everybody. But the problem is that the Greek word used here is ethnos. You can hear our word ethnic in that word from the Greek. And while it can mean nations, it also means, and this is especially true for Jews like our gospel writer Matthew, it means those other nations. It means, it has connotations of those other folks, and it's usually translated Gentiles, as a matter of fact, rather than nations. And so it would seem that when we hear it, we're supposed to hear it like Matthew does, speaking of those folks, those other nations, not us, those other ethnic groups that are not like us. And so perhaps Jesus is including the Gentiles in this scene of judgment, or perhaps he's talking about only the Gentiles. Actually, this latter seems more likely when you consider what the criterion is for judgment that Jesus lists. How these people have treated the least of those who are members of his family, which is to say, his followers. And when you consider that the very end of Matthew's gospel will be the risen Jesus commissioning the disciples and the church to go and make disciples of all nations, that is, all Gentiles, that it seems that the people being judged in this scene are the targets of Christian evangelism. But curiously, they are not judged on whether or not they accepted the Christian message. They are judged rather on whether or not they cared for those Christians that they encounter. Now this is of a lot more practical concern that may at first be obvious to us. In the very early years of the church with traveling missionaries, those missionaries were absolutely dependent upon the hospitality of strangers. And if they got tossed into prison along the way, as happened quite a good bit with the Apostle Paul, they would be dependent on others for food. In Roman prisons, people got fed by friends or family or kind strangers who brought them something to eat. Now, when I was growing up in the church, I always presumed that this scripture was simply telling us that we were to care for the sick and the hungry, we were to welcome the stranger, and we were to visit those in prison. And I still think it's recommending that to us. But when you view this picture as the final judgment of those folks, of those outside the church, well, then it clearly has something more to say to those of us who are in the church. First of all, I think this passage demands a very real caution about any sort of Christian arrogance. If Jesus judges as righteous those who have been kind to his followers who happen to be in need, then who are we to draw boundaries that cast out those who don't abide by our beliefs or our creeds? But even more, the scene that Jesus describes in this judgment can exist only when the church has gone out into the world and put itself at risk for the sake of the world. Jesus seems to expect that the church will put itself in situations where it is dependent on the care and the hospitality and the welcome and the nurture of non-Christian strangers. Now, almost any pastor who has served in Presbyterian Church in recent years and decades has probably not been able to avoid going to conferences or seminars as well as reading books and articles on evangelism and on church growth in this time in our church's life when we have experienced membership losses without parallel in history. I've certainly been to my share of those events and read my share of those articles and books. And in so doing, I have repeatedly come across a very similar story told by a lot of pastors and church leaders who are very focused on evangelism. They tell how their own congregations began to complain to them about how they were spending too much time out there among those non-church people. We hired you to take care of us, they insisted. But somehow that seems at odds with Jesus' own expectation of the church. His church. The church he calls to risk itself for the sake of the world. In just a few moments, we will gather together as the people of God at the Lord's table. And as we prepare for that, we will hear once again familiar words. This is my body that is broken for you. Jesus gives himself, pours out his life for the sake of the world, and he calls his church to emulate him, to give itself for others, to risk its life for others. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will find it. You know, it's funny when you ponder it. We Christians tend to think of ourselves as having something wonderful that we can share with the world. And of course we do. But in the scenario that Jesus describes for us today, salvation, ours and the world's, is connected to our becoming vulnerable to and even dependent on the world. Just as Jesus gave himself for us, so we are called to give ourselves for them. All praise and glory to the one who gave himself for our sakes, that we might know new life, true life, found in giving ourselves for others. Thanks be to God.